"Claire, where is your mother's emerald necklace?" The question stopped me cold. For a moment, I simply stared across the crowded room, convinced I had misheard. My cousin Denise stood beside the dessert table holding a paper plate with a slice of pecan pie, waiting for an answer. Around us, conversations continued, forks clinked against china, and laughter drifted through the community center where my aunt's 75th birthday celebration was being held. But all I could hear were those 7 words. "Where is your mother's emerald necklace?" I forced a small smile. "I haven't seen it in months," I replied. "I thought I misplaced it after moving some things into storage." Denise frowned. "That's strange. I could have sworn I saw someone wearing it recently." She said it casually, then turned to greet another relative, unaware that she had just unsettled everything I thought I knew. I remained standing there, my coffee growing cold in my hand. The necklace she mentioned wasn't just jewelry. It was the last meaningful thing my mother, Evelyn Brooks, had ever given me. The emerald pendant had belonged to my grandmother before her and had been passed down through 3 generations of women in our family. My mother wore it every Christmas, every anniversary dinner, every family photograph that mattered. When she passed away 2 years earlier, she placed it in my hands and told me to keep it safe. I remembered every detail of that moment. The softness of her voice, the warmth of her hand, the way sunlight filtered through the hospital window and reflected off the emerald stone. Losing it had felt like losing a part of her all over again. For months, I blamed myself. I searched closets, drawers, storage boxes, and every corner of my house. I retraced old routines. I opened containers I hadn't touched in years. Nothing. Eventually, I accepted the painful possibility that it was gone forever. Yet Denise's question reopened a door I had worked hard to close. During the drive home that evening, memories began surfacing one after another. The last time I clearly remembered seeing the necklace was at a family gathering hosted by my in-laws. It had been a crowded afternoon, filled with children running through the backyard, relatives carrying folding chairs across the lawn, and trays of food covering every available surface. I distinctly remembered removing the necklace before helping clean up a spilled pitcher of lemonade. After that, everything became blurry. Had I put it back on? Had I left it in my purse? Had someone else noticed it? The more I thought about it, the less certain I became. When I arrived home, I pulled into my driveway and sat in my car longer than usual. The porch light cast a pale glow across the front yard. Normally, the sight comforted me. Tonight, it felt different, uneasy. I walked inside, set down my keys, and opened the cedar chest where I kept photographs and family keepsakes. On top rested an old picture of my mother smiling beside a Christmas tree. Around her neck hung the emerald necklace. I ran my finger gently across the image. Then another memory surfaced. A strange look exchanged between my mother-in-law Judith and her daughter Samantha during that gathering months earlier. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it felt important. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe grief was making me imagine connections where none existed. But as I stared at that photograph, a thought settled heavily in my mind. What if the necklace had never been lost at all? What if someone had taken it? And if that was true, why had they kept silent for so long? That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every detail I could remember. Every conversation, every glance, every unexplained moment. By sunrise, one thing had become clear. For the first time since my mother died, I no longer believed the necklace had simply disappeared. I believed someone knew exactly where it was. The next morning, I made coffee before sunrise and sat alone at my kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of a passing car outside. I should have been thinking about my errands for the day or the volunteer shift I had scheduled later that week. Instead, I found myself staring at an old photograph album spread open in front of me. Page after page, my mother smiled back at me. In nearly every important picture, the emerald necklace rested around her neck like a familiar companion. Looking at those photographs reminded me why I had never truly stopped searching for it. The necklace was not the most expensive thing my mother owned. It was not the largest inheritance she left behind. Yet it carried something no amount of money could replace. Every scratch on the clasp, every tiny imperfection in the setting, held a story from our family history. I remembered sitting beside her as a little girl while she prepared for church on Sunday mornings. She would fasten the necklace carefully, then let me hold the pendant for a moment before placing it back against her collarbone. She always told me that family treasures were not valuable because of what they were worth. They were valuable because of what they remembered. As the morning light filled the room, another memory surfaced. About 6 months before the necklace disappeared, my mother-in-law Judith had commented on it during Thanksgiving dinner. She had picked it up gently and examined it longer than seemed necessary. I remembered her asking whether it was authentic. At the time, I thought nothing of the question. Many people admired the necklace. It was unusual and elegant without being flashy. But now I found myself wondering why that conversation stood out so clearly in my memory. I turned another page in the album and saw a photograph from the family gathering where I last remembered wearing it. The image had been taken in the backyard behind Judith and Frank Harper's house. Folding tables were lined up beneath string lights. Children were chasing one another across the grass. Everyone appeared happy. Yet the longer I studied the photograph, the more details I noticed. Samantha Harper was standing only a few feet away from me. Judith was beside her. Both were looking in my direction. Neither seemed interested in the camera. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Suspicion was not proof. Memories could become distorted when viewed through the lens of loss and regret. Still, I could not ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside me. By noon, I decided to do something I should have done months earlier. I opened several storage containers in the garage and searched through them one final time. I examined every box, every envelope, every piece of wrapped china from my last move. Hours passed. Dust covered my hands. My back ached. The result was exactly the same as before. The necklace was nowhere to be found. Standing alone in that garage, I finally accepted a difficult truth. If I had misplaced it, I would have found it by now. When I returned inside, I sat down with my laptop and began scrolling through old social media photographs from family events. At first, I was simply looking for reassurance. Then I stopped suddenly. My heart began beating faster. In a photograph posted several months earlier, Samantha stood at a charity luncheon wearing a green gemstone pendant. The image was grainy and taken from a distance. I could not be certain, yet something about it looked painfully familiar. I leaned closer to the screen. For the first time, I felt that I was no longer searching for a lost necklace. I was searching for the truth. For the next several days, I resisted the urge to make assumptions. A blurry photograph was not evidence. It was only a possibility. Still, I could not stop thinking about it. Every time I looked at the image on my laptop screen, my eyes were drawn to the green stone resting against Samantha Harper's dress. The shape seemed right. The color seemed right. Even the length of the chain looked familiar. Yet I knew I needed more than a feeling. I needed facts. I enlarged the photograph as much as I could without losing detail. The image became grainy, but certain features remained visible. The pendant appeared to have the same oval shape as my mother's necklace. There also seemed to be a small silver detail near the clasp, something my mother had added years earlier after the original fastener wore out. My stomach tightened. That detail had always made the necklace unique. I closed the laptop and walked away. I wanted to be careful. The last thing I wanted was to accuse someone unfairly. Later that week, I attended another family gathering, this time at Frank and Judith Harper's house. I told myself I was there simply to enjoy dinner and spend time with relatives. In reality, I was paying attention, more attention than I ever had before. The evening seemed ordinary on the surface. Judith talked about her garden. Frank discussed a local construction project. Nathan chatted with cousins about football. Samantha arrived nearly 30 minutes late carrying a designer handbag and apologizing for traffic. Everyone welcomed her warmly. I smiled and greeted her just like I always had. Then I noticed something strange. The moment I asked how she had been doing lately, she glanced quickly toward Judith. It lasted less than a second, but it felt rehearsed, almost as if she wanted reassurance before answering. The reaction stayed with me throughout the meal. As dinner continued, I began noticing other things. Whenever conversation drifted toward family keepsakes, Samantha became unusually quiet. When someone mentioned inherited jewelry from a grandmother, Judith immediately changed the subject and started discussing vacation plans. Frank seemed distracted. More than once, I caught him staring down at his plate instead of participating in the conversation. None of it proved anything. Yet together, the small moments created a pattern I could not ignore. After dessert, several relatives gathered in the living room to take photographs. Samantha stood near a lamp while someone snapped pictures for social media. I noticed she adjusted the collar of her blouse several times. It looked almost deliberate, as though she wanted to keep something hidden beneath the fabric. By the time I drove home, questions were multiplying faster than answers. That night, I searched through social media again. This time I focused on Samantha's public photographs from the past year. Many images had been removed. Others appeared heavily edited. Then I found something unusual. A photograph from a charity luncheon had disappeared entirely since the last time I viewed it. I checked twice to be certain. It was gone. The picture containing the green pendant no longer existed. I sat quietly in front of the screen for several minutes. People delete photographs every day for innocent reasons. I understood that, but the timing felt impossible to ignore. Someone had removed the one image that had captured my attention. As I stared at the empty space where the photograph once appeared, a cold realization settled over me. If there was nothing to hide, why erase the picture at all? The disappearance of that photograph changed something inside me. Until then, I had been willing to believe there might be an innocent explanation for everything. Perhaps I had overlooked a box during my searches. Perhaps the pendant in the image merely resembled my mother's necklace. Perhaps I was allowing grief to cloud my judgment. But deleted photographs do not erase questions. They often create new ones. The following afternoon, I decided to organize every detail I could remember. I spread notebooks across my dining room table and began writing dates, events, and names. I listed every occasion when I had worn the necklace during the previous year before it vanished. I noted family gatherings, church events, holiday dinners, and birthday celebrations. Then I marked the last confirmed sighting. The timeline pointed repeatedly toward the same period, the same group of people, the same house. As I worked, another memory surfaced unexpectedly. A few weeks after the necklace disappeared, Judith had visited my home for coffee. During that visit, she asked whether I had ever considered having the necklace professionally appraised. At the time, I thought she was making conversation. Looking back, the question felt different. Too specific, too interested. I could still hear the way she had asked it. Calm, casual, almost rehearsed. Later that evening, I called my friend Barbara, a woman I had known for more than 20 years. Barbara possessed the rare ability to notice details other people missed. Without making accusations, I described everything that had happened. She listened quietly until I finished. Then she asked a simple question. Has Samantha ever shown an unusual interest in jewelry? I thought about it. The answer was yes. Samantha loved designer accessories and often discussed luxury brands. She frequently posted photographs from charity events, fundraisers, and social gatherings. Image mattered to her. Appearance mattered to her. That realization did not prove anything, but it added another piece to a puzzle that was slowly taking shape. Over the next few days, I continued searching online. Most of Samantha's public photographs showed clothing, vacations, and social events. Then I found something interesting. A local charity organization had posted dozens of images from the luncheon where I believed I had seen the green pendant. Unlike Samantha's account, the organization's page had not removed every photograph. I carefully examined each image. Many were taken from across the room. Others captured small groups, standing near display tables. Then I stopped. In the background of one photograph, partially obscured by another guest, stood Samantha. The image was blurry, but the pendant was visible. My pulse quickened. I enlarged the photograph several times. The stone appeared dark green. The shape looked oval. Most importantly, a small reflective detail near the chain seemed identical to the customized clasp my mother had added years earlier. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. It was still not enough to make a formal accusation. Yet for the first time, I felt I was moving beyond suspicion and into evidence. Someone else might dismiss the image. I could not. I had seen that necklace hundreds of times throughout my life. I knew its details the way a person knows the face of a loved one. As the evening grew darker outside my window, I saved copies of every photograph I had found. Then I created a folder on my computer and placed them inside. Before shutting down for the night, I looked at the enlarged image one final time. A single thought echoed in my mind. If Samantha truly possessed the necklace, she had not been hiding it nearly as carefully as she believed. The more evidence I collected, the more determined I became to remain calm. Anger would not help me. Assumptions would not help me. Facts would. That became my rule. Every morning, I reviewed the photographs I had saved. Every evening, I added notes to the timeline spread across my dining room table. Slowly, the gaps in the story began to shrink. One afternoon, while organizing old family paperwork, I came across something. I had nearly forgotten. Years earlier, my mother had insured several valuable heirlooms, including the emerald necklace. The policy documents contained detailed descriptions, measurements, and photographs taken by a professional appraiser. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the folder. There it was, a clear image of the necklace from multiple angles. The custom clasp, the shape of the emerald, the delicate silver setting surrounding the stone. Every detail was documented. For the first time, I had an objective reference instead of relying solely on memory. I placed the appraisal photographs beside the enlarged image from the charity luncheon. The quality was different, but certain features matched in ways that were difficult to dismiss. The distinctive clasp appeared nearly identical. The proportions looked the same. Even the way the pendant hung from the chain seemed familiar. I stared at both images for a long time. Then I made copies and stored them safely. A few days later, an unexpected opportunity appeared. A mutual acquaintance mentioned attending another charity event where Samantha had been present. During casual conversation, I asked whether any photographs from the event had been posted online. She pointed me toward a local community website. That evening, I searched through dozens of images. Most were ordinary, people smiling beside donation tables, guests posing near banners, volunteers greeting attendees. Then I found another photograph containing Samantha. This image was clearer than the others. The pendant was partially visible near the neckline of her dress. Once again, the shape looked remarkably familiar. More importantly, this photograph had been taken months after my necklace disappeared. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. A pattern was emerging. The same piece of jewelry appeared repeatedly. Different events, different dates, different photographs, yet always the same green stone. The next weekend, Nathan and I attended a family barbecue hosted by Judith and Frank. I did not mention the necklace. I did not mention the photographs. Instead, I watched. Samantha arrived carrying a large tote bag and wearing oversized sunglasses. Despite the mild weather, during lunch, conversation drifted toward family keepsakes and inherited possessions after one cousin discussed restoring an antique watch. The reaction around the table was immediate. Judith changed the subject. Frank suddenly became interested in refilling drinks. Samantha focused on her phone. The shift was subtle, but impossible to miss. Later that afternoon, while helping clear dishes from the patio, I overheard part of a conversation between Judith and Samantha near the kitchen doorway. The words were quiet and incomplete, but one sentence reached me clearly. Just make sure nobody sees it. The moment they noticed me nearby, the conversation ended. Both women smiled. Both acted as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet the silence that followed felt heavier than any explanation. Driving home that evening, I replayed those words repeatedly in my mind. Perhaps they referred to something entirely unrelated. Perhaps not. What troubled me most was that every new detail seemed to point in the same direction. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I understood something important. I was no longer searching for clues about what happened. I was getting close to discovering who knew the truth. The following Tuesday, an unexpected phone call pushed the entire situation in a direction I never anticipated. I had spent the morning organizing paperwork when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, and I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. A woman introduced herself as Melissa Grant. At first, her name meant nothing to me. Then she explained that she worked at a jewelry appraisal business in the neighboring county. What happened next immediately captured my attention. Melissa told me she had recently attended a community fundraiser where she recognized me from a local charity board newsletter. During a conversation with another guest, my name came up unexpectedly. She hesitated before continuing, clearly unsure whether she should share what she knew. According to Melissa, several months earlier, a woman matching Samantha Harper's description had visited her office carrying an emerald pendant. Melissa remembered it because the piece was unusual and appeared to be an older family heirloom rather than a modern design. My heart began racing. I carefully asked whether she was certain about the identification. Melissa explained that she could not guarantee it was the same necklace, but she remembered the visitor mentioning that the piece had belonged to a relative and that she wanted an estimate of its value. The description alone was enough to make me sit down. I thanked her for calling and asked whether she had any documentation. She explained that appraisal consultations generated records, although client privacy policies limited what she could disclose without proper authorization. Even so, the conversation left me stunned. After hanging up, I stared at my phone for several minutes. For months, I had been collecting fragments, photographs, memories, suspicious reactions. Now, for the first time, an independent person had unknowingly connected Samantha to an emerald pendant. I did not celebrate. I did not assume victory. Instead, I added Melissa's information to my growing timeline. Later that evening, I reviewed everything again from the beginning. The last confirmed sighting of the necklace, the family gathering, the photographs, the deleted image, the conversations that abruptly ended whenever heirlooms were mentioned, the comment I overheard near Judith's kitchen. Individually, each detail could be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. 2 days later, I attended a community luncheon with several longtime friends. During the event, I happened to mention that I had been researching family heirlooms. One woman immediately recognized the description of my mother's necklace. She recalled seeing a remarkably similar pendant at a charity auction preview several months earlier. The item had never reached auction because its owner apparently withdrew it before the event began. Once again, no one could prove it was the same necklace, yet the timing aligned almost perfectly with everything else. By the time I returned home that afternoon, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and determination. More than anything, I wanted someone to simply tell the truth. I wanted a straightforward explanation. Instead, every answer seemed hidden behind another door. As evening settled outside my windows, I opened my laptop to organize the newest information. That was when I noticed something I had overlooked before. One of the charity photographs contained a reflection in a glass display case behind Samantha. The reflection was faint, almost invisible. I enlarged the image several times. Slowly, a clearer outline emerged. What I saw made my breath catch. For the first time, I believed I was looking at evidence that could identify the necklace beyond any reasonable doubt. For nearly an hour, I studied that photograph. The reflection was faint, distorted by the curved glass surface, but certain details were unmistakable. The pendant appeared from a different angle than any image I had previously found. More importantly, the reflection revealed part of the side setting. My mother's necklace had a tiny imperfection there, a small mark created decades earlier when my grandmother accidentally dropped it while cleaning. It was not damage most people would notice. To anyone else, it meant nothing. To me, it was as recognizable as a fingerprint. I enlarged the image again and compared it to the professional appraisal photographs from my mother's records. The location matched perfectly. I felt a chill run through me. For months, uncertainty had followed me everywhere. Now, for the first time, I felt reasonably certain that the necklace appearing in those photographs was the same one that had vanished from my life. Yet certainty brought no satisfaction. It only raised a more painful question. Why? Why would anyone take something that meant so much to me? The next several days were difficult. Every family memory became tangled with suspicion. Every conversation replayed differently in my mind. I kept remembering how warmly I had always treated Judith, Frank, and Samantha. Holidays, birthdays, family dinners, graduations. We had shared years of traditions. I had trusted them completely. That was what hurt most. Not the value of the necklace, not even the possibility that it had been taken. It was the realization that someone I considered family might have watched me search for it while knowing exactly where it was. Eventually, I decided I needed one final opportunity for the truth to emerge voluntarily. I was not interested in public embarrassment. I was not interested in arguments. I simply wanted honesty. The following Saturday, I invited Judith and Samantha to lunch at a quiet restaurant a few miles outside town. The atmosphere was pleasant and relaxed. Soft music played in the background. Families chatted over sandwiches and iced tea. For the first 20 minutes, we discussed ordinary topics: gardening, community events, vacation plans. Then I carefully shifted the conversation. I have been thinking about my mother's necklace again, I said calmly. The reaction was immediate. Samantha looked down at her menu, even though she had already ordered. Judith reached for her water glass. Neither woman spoke. I continued gently. I recently found some photographs that raised questions. Samantha's expression tightened. What kind of questions? She asked. I explained that several images appeared to show a pendant remarkably similar to my mother's heirloom. I did not accuse anyone. I did not raise my voice. I simply described what I had found. The response surprised me. Samantha laughed. It sounded forced. She insisted the pendant in the photographs belonged to a friend. Judith quickly agreed. Then, Only moments later, she claimed she had never actually seen the pendant herself. The contradiction was obvious. Even they seemed to realize it. The conversation became increasingly uncomfortable. Explanations changed from one minute to the next. Details failed to align. By the time lunch ended, I had learned something important. Neither woman appeared interested in helping me find answers. They seemed interested only in ending the discussion. That evening, I sat alone on my back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The evidence folder on my laptop continued growing. The timeline continued expanding. And now the explanations themselves were beginning to unravel. As darkness settled across the yard, I reached a difficult conclusion. If the truth was ever going to surface, I would probably have to force the issue. The next step would change everything. The following morning, I made a decision I had hoped to avoid. Before doing anything else, I organized every piece of information I had gathered into a single folder. The appraisal records, the photographs, the timeline, notes from conversations, screenshots from community websites. Everything was arranged chronologically. As I reviewed the material one final time, I realized how far the situation had progressed. What had started as a missing family heirloom had become a chain of unanswered questions supported by increasingly troubling details. More importantly, I had already given opportunities for honesty. Those opportunities had been ignored. I called Samantha later that afternoon. My voice remained calm throughout the conversation. I told her I wanted to resolve everything privately and respectfully. There was a long pause before she responded. Then she insisted once again that she knew nothing about the necklace. When I mentioned the photographs, her tone immediately changed. She claimed the images proved nothing. When I mentioned the appraisal records, she became defensive. Then she abruptly ended the call. Less than an hour later, Judith called. The timing was impossible to miss. She sounded irritated before I even spoke. She accused me of creating unnecessary drama within the family. She suggested that grief was causing me to imagine connections that did not exist. When I calmly explained that I was relying on documented evidence rather than assumptions, she became noticeably quieter. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she repeated something that caught my attention immediately. "You should just let this go, Claire. Not solve it. Not investigate it. Let it go." The phrase stayed with me long after the conversation ended. People who want the truth usually encourage transparency. They do not encourage silence. That evening, Nathan and I sat together at the kitchen table. Until then, I had shielded him from many of the details because I knew how difficult the situation would be for him. These were his parents, his sister, his family, yet I could no longer carry the burden alone. For nearly 2 hours, I walked him through everything from beginning to end. The photographs, the deleted posts, the appraisal connection, the conflicting explanations, the conversations. When I finished, he remained silent for a long time. Finally, he looked down at the folder in front of him and sighed. "I do not know what to think anymore," he admitted quietly. It was not the response I wanted, but it was honest. And honesty had become increasingly rare. 3 days later, another unexpected development occurred. Melissa Grant called again. She explained that after our previous conversation, she had reviewed some archived appointment records. While she could not disclose confidential details, she confirmed that the consultation involving the emerald pendant had taken place during the exact period when my necklace was already missing. The timing aligned perfectly. After ending the call, I stared out the window of my living room. Autumn leaves drifted across the yard. Everything outside looked peaceful. Inside, however, I knew a turning point had arrived. The evidence was no longer shrinking. It was growing. The explanations were no longer becoming clearer. They were becoming less believable. That night, I sat at my desk and looked at the folder one final time. Then I reached for my phone. If the truth was not going to emerge voluntarily, someone with the authority to examine the facts would need to become involved. I took a deep breath, unlocked the screen, and began searching for the number that would set the next chapter of this story into motion. The next morning, I contacted the local police department and requested guidance regarding a missing family heirloom. I was careful with my wording. I did not make accusations. I did not claim certainty. I simply explained that I possessed documentation suggesting that an item belonging to my late mother might be in someone else's possession. Within a few days, I was contacted by Officer Ryan Keller. From the beginning, he impressed me with his professionalism. He listened patiently as I explained the timeline from start to finish. He reviewed the appraisal records, the photographs, the notes I had collected, and the information connected to the appraisal consultation. Unlike family members who had dismissed my concerns, he focused entirely on facts. When our meeting ended, I felt something I had not felt in months. Relief. Someone was finally willing to examine the situation objectively. Over the following weeks, Officer Keller continued gathering information. I was not involved in most of the process, but occasionally he contacted me to clarify dates or provide additional documentation. During that time, communication from Judith and Samantha became increasingly strained. Phone calls went unanswered. Family invitations stopped arriving. Word had clearly spread that I was no longer willing to ignore the situation. Yet despite the tension, I remained committed to one principle. I wanted the truth, not revenge. One afternoon, Officer Keller called with an update. His voice remained measured and professional, but I immediately sensed that something significant had happened. He informed me that information obtained during the inquiry had confirmed important parts of the timeline. The necklace had indeed surfaced after it disappeared from my possession. Additional records supported that conclusion. For several moments, I could not speak. The months of doubt, second-guessing, and uncertainty suddenly felt very far away. The truth I had been chasing was finally becoming visible. A few days later, I received another call. This time, the news was even more important. The heirloom had been recovered. I sat silently at my kitchen table after ending the conversation. Sunlight streamed through the window exactly as it had on the morning I first opened my mother's photograph album. The difference was that now the search was over. When I was eventually reunited with the necklace, I opened the presentation box slowly. There it was, the familiar emerald, the silver setting, the tiny imperfection my grandmother had accidentally created decades earlier. For a moment, it felt as though time had folded back on itself. I could almost hear my mother's voice again. I could almost see her smiling across the room. Tears filled my eyes, but they were not tears of victory. They were tears of gratitude. The heirloom had come home. The weeks that followed were uncomfortable for the Harper family. Relationships became strained. Difficult conversations took place. Explanations changed repeatedly. Blame shifted from one person to another. Yet none of that mattered as much to me as people expected. What mattered was the lesson I learned. Trust is far more valuable than any piece of jewelry. Once broken, it is not easily restored. The necklace returned to the cedar chest, where I kept my most precious family memories. Sometimes I open the box and look at it for a few moments before closing it again. Not because of its financial value, not because of the investigation, but because it reminds me of my mother and the values she tried to teach me. Honesty matters. Integrity matters. Family should matter most of all. Sadly, not everyone lives by those principles. In the end, I recovered the heirloom that connected generations of women in my family. What I could not recover was the trust that disappeared along with it. And perhaps that was the greatest loss of all.